Hi guys, and welcome back to Dudley Central. In this video I'm going to show you how I created my retaining wall for my station. I really enjoyed this project. I tried out a couple of new techniques and I just really wanted to share with you guys how I actually did it. I hope you like what you see. Comments are always appreciated. Thank you. So despite the real Dudley station being long gone, I wanted to create something that reflected the local architecture. So I did a bit of Googling and I found that the brickwork around Dudley tends to be blue brick, particularly where the station used to sit. So I was very eager to reflect that in my station. I also wanted to have it weathered to show some age, but not to the point where it looked as if the local youths had terrorised the station. At the end of the day, the station staff would have ideally kept it quite clean, graffiti away from this area. It is something that I will reflect elsewhere on the layout, perhaps in the lesser kept areas, but for the station I wanted to keep it clean, but to show some age. So to kick off with, I just wanted to list off what I used in this project. For the main wall I used ratio 537, the retaining arches, and Will's SS36, which gave me a bit of extra height on top of the arches. These seem to tie in quite well. I've also just listed some of the paints that I've used to get the overall colour and effect that I got. So the first thing I did, I took my 2mm thick card, which I bought off eBay. You can get these in big packs. I cut it to the height of my backboard on my layout. I wanted to make sure that it came to the same height. Just make sure your knife is nice and sharp, as it can blunt quite quickly on this stuff. So moving on, I needed to measure where the retaining wall would actually sit on this bit of card at the back. I needed to account for the underlay beneath the platform, the height of the platform itself, and then I could work out the base of the retaining wall. So when you first unpack the ratio retaining walls, you'll find on the back that they actually have a bit of plastic moulding on the rear side. I'm not sure if this is just part of a manufacturing process or the intention is to have the bottom kicking out a little bit against the surface, but for me I wanted a perfectly vertical wall, so I needed to cut these off. Again, just make sure your knife is nice and sharp, and just be careful of your fingers when you're cutting these off. So the next thing I turned my head towards was actually attaching the retaining walls to the card. For this I used rocket card glue. I think this stuff's excellent and will pretty much glue anything. So what I did was I lined up my retaining wall on the card to kind of approximate where it will sit, put the glue down, and then I laid the retaining wall against that baseline that I drew previously, because the bottom edge was the critical edge in my eyes. The second piece of retaining wall was quite critical actually, because it would essentially set where the next piece of card would lie underneath. Now this piece, I'd say about 3/4 of it fit on the existing piece of card, so I lined this up against the baseline and against the already stuck down retaining wall, making sure I had a nice square fit, but this would leave a bit of an overlap for the next piece of card to come along. So the next piece of card had its line already drawn on it for where the platform would sit, so essentially what I needed to do was line them up so that the overlapping wall would fit straight on. After I was happy the second piece was secured down, I then came on to bring the third piece, which was easy because there was no overlapping card joint, and this was just lined squarely with a second piece. The process was essentially the same for the following pieces, giving me a length of 6 retaining walls. Using the Wills dressed stone, I now set about adding height to the retaining walls. There was a little bit of preliminary work that needed to be done with these walls as they come out of the packaging. They've got a little bit of excess plastic around the edges. You just need to come and tidy these up with your craft knife, just make sure it's nice and sharp. Once I measured up the appropriate height, I came along with my pen and just marked onto the plastic card where I wanted to cut, and then with a steel rule used my knife to give a nice neat edge on the wall. One of the tips that the walls actually give you in the packaging is to score it once and then fold along the score line, and this will actually give you a neater edge than if you just try and cut through with a knife, and I did find this to work quite well. It was then just a repetitive process. I tried to use the same positions for the cuts of brickwork so that they all kind of matched. There's a couple of sheets of the Wills brick walls in the packaging, so I just tried to use the same parts from each sheet because they're all the same. Because the Wills sheets didn't quite line up in terms of length with the retaining walls, I needed to come up with something creative to span the gaps where the abutments are on the walls. For this, I cut some small sections of the Wills sheets and, as I'll come on to later, customised it for something else to make it look a bit more realistic. After testing if my piece is actually fitted, I then came in with my rocket card glue and started to glue the bits together. I started at the one end where it came to the edge of the card, as this would be a good base to start from, and then I could add all the other pieces and have a flush end at the other end. With the first layer of Will's dressed stone all glued down, I now looked at addressing the abutment area. For this I cut some 1cm strips off the remaining bits of dressed stone that I had, and then came along and glued these in areas above the abutments. For the glue I used some of the glue that you get for the Revel plastic kits. Any kind of plastic glue will do. Just be really careful it doesn't drip too far, as it can affect the stonework on the visible patches. On the far left of the wall I needed something flat so that the station could tie in quite nicely. So again I just came in with a dressed stone and fit it in within the space, and then what I did was I made a small abutment that kind of reflected what was on the ratio retaining wall. I glued this in using the Revel glue as before. So the next part was a little bit challenging. This will be incorporating the canopy into the retaining wall. Now I don't have the canopy actually featured in this video, but it is the Keybri 39568 kit. I'll just put it up on the screen for a moment. And what I'll be doing will be tying it into the retaining wall using the capping beams that come with the ratio retaining arches kit. Now for this, what I planned on doing was using the narrow bit as a kind of deck for the canopy to land on. From a viewer's perspective, once this was in, it looked like the ironwork on the canopy was built in to the concrete, much like what they have at Darlington Station. So what I did was I came with my plastic glue and glued that section to the larger capping beam with a cyano glue, and once it had gone off, I then glued it between the abutments on the ratio retaining wall. The end piece on the far right needed something a little bit different, so what I did was I scored a piece of the capping beam and folded it so that I'd get a 90-degree angle. I then came in with a little narrow piece and glued this in, and it gave me a nice corner edge. With everything stuck in, I was quite happy with how it was looking, so I now turn my attention to painting. I first started off using the Halford's Grey primer. I found this stuff to be excellent and it's really good value as well. I've had this tin for loads of projects. It really does go quite far. Once the primer had been left for a couple of hours to go off, I then turned my attention to actually painting it. Now, there are so many different methods when you look online for painting brickwork, but I settled on this one. I went with painting the mortar first. So all the paints that I've used are acrylic. I don't really like to have enamel paints in the flat if I can help it, just with a little one about. So the paint that I've used was Tamiya X57 for the mortar, and that was, I think it's called Buff. I really like the Tamiya paints. I think they're really good quality. So essentially for painting the mortar, as you can see, the colour of the paint pot, it's very, very milky. I've used basically a drop of paint. That whole pot is full of water, and it's very, very runny. What you want to do is just run your brush over the entire piece, and you just want everything to be absolutely soaking. The idea of it being so runny is that the paint can get into all the cracks and doesn't stay on the top surface. Don't worry about how it looks at this point. It's when you come in later with the darker colours that it really comes to fruition. I did later find that the areas which had a heavier amount of runny mortar paint on it actually stain the brickwork quite effectively. I've looked at Google Images, and Birmingham Moor Street sprung to mind, where there's quite a lot of white staining, which almost looks like it's bleeding from the mortar, and it does look quite realistic. So it's worth bearing in mind if you've got areas where you particularly want this white staining. It is worth going a bit heavier in these areas, and perhaps a second layer of this runny mortar colour might help you in that area. What was quite pleasing at this point was, now that the paint was going down, there was a bit more uniformity between the ratio retaining walls and the Wills brick sheets that I'd used above, and it was just quite pleasing to see how well they matched at this point, even before the darker colours had been put on. After finishing the mortar coat, it was important to give it a few hours to dry off, just to make sure all the runny paint had run into all the cracks and had time to dry, leaving a deposit of the mortar behind. So at this point I now looked at adding the darker colours. For this I used Tamiya Field Blue, which was XF50, and what I did here was I dry brushed it onto the retaining wall. It's really important when you're doing this to get your brush as dry as possible. What I used here was just a bit of scrap piece of card, and I just got my brush, dipped it in the pot very lightly, and just rubbed it onto the card just to get it as dry as possible. Then it's a case of just coming to your brickwork and building it up nice and slowly. The trick here is to be gentle and be careful. It's always easier to add more. If you add too much, it's very difficult to take away, and you might end up having to start it again. So what I'd advise is go over lightly, and if you want it darker, wait till it's dry and then come back again and brush over it. So what you want to do really is just try and get into all the bits and pieces, but do it lightly. If you go too hard, you'll start to fill in the cracks where the mortar paint is, and then you'll lose that effect. So just go very lightly, just dab your brush. It doesn't really matter whether it's the same way or not. It's almost better actually if you do it in different brush strokes, because it won't look as uniform. So just do it in all different directions if you can. For the capping beam, I just did exactly the same method. However, I just went back to my XF57 buff paint and just dry brushed that on. I did it very lightly, tried to let the primer colour come through a little bit more to make it look a bit aged. Overall I was quite happy with how that came out. So once I was happy the wall had dried, I wanted to add some signage. First I like to just put the signs on where I think I'd like to do them, and then I'll come along and glue them. For this I used the Deluxe Materials glue and glaze. I didn't want to use the rocket car glue because I can find that to be sometimes quite runny, and I didn't want to affect the finish on my wall. I find this glue and glaze is a little bit more stable in that respect, and it sets clear as well. So I came along and just glued them. So the Centro signs with Dudley Central, they were made by Signage. I've also got some timetables and information boards, and then I also wanted to add the original network YouTube map, which I've had on my previous layouts. Again, all of those just used glue and glaze to secure them down, and I just tried to line everything up using the lines on the brickwork to make sure everything was sitting nice and square. I had a lot of fun with this project and learnt some new techniques. It was very enjoyable. I thought it was quite easy, to be honest, and I hope that some of these tips might help you on one of your projects. Comments are always welcome, and feel free to subscribe as well. Bye for now.